Okay, so we were looking at the Chassam Sofer's letter to the Hamburg Bezdin, and they had asked him, what he thinks of the organ being played in a show and prayer in the local language. So he said, and one of the things we pointed out was how interesting it is that at this early time in the Reform movement, his treatment of it, even the Chassam Sofer, who's more of a radical anti, is really kind of playing it out on a halachic field, which is interesting. It says something about how he sees early Reform. I think 30 years later it would be a very different story. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, it's totally different even for German Orthodox, how they see Reform. Uvinian and actually Shamshon Fall Hirsch saw the Reform in a light in which he wasn't even willing to join with them in communal issues, although other rabbis, even more Haredi than him, were. So he says, in terms of playing an instrument in the show, we see that our ancestors decreed that we should daven 3 times a day, and we should daven in a community, and we should daven in structured prayer. But they did not instruct us that instruments, even though we had instruments in the temple, should be part of prayer. And prayer is, the idea of structured prayer that we have. Obviously, there's spontaneous prayer a person can do and could fulfill their mitzvah from the Torah praying. But the concept of structured prayer that we have, which is rabbinic, is the product of rabbinic decree, or rabbinic outline, rabbinic vision, and kli shira, instruments were not part of that. That's what he argues. Even though we had it in the temple, nevertheless, our ancestors put that aside for our prayer. So you see that they did not think it was a good idea that from the time that the temple was destroyed, as maybe it means specifically that we're not supposed to have instruments as part of prayer, because it was part of the temple. It was part of the temple, and the temple's destroyed, so that's not part of prayer anymore. That's interesting. That might be an argument even for not having instruments on Erev Shabbat, for L'cha Dodi or for Kabbalat Shabbat, like we saw that some places did. Maybe, although I'm not sure that's even part of prayer. That would also be an interesting question. It says in the verse, how can we sing a song to God al admat nechar, on foreign land? In other words, how in exile are we able to sing to God? It doesn't say before non-Jews. It says when we're in exile on foreign land. V'imgam the hutar ktsas the samech b'nei, and even if we're allowed to play instruments for joy, like for a bride and a groom, because that goes against the concept of exile, and we do have a mitzvah to make the bride and groom happy. But in the house of God, he says it should definitely be forbidden. That's an interesting idea. In other words, he's saying in a shul, it should be even more forbidden than outside shul, because a shul is the sign that the temple has been destroyed. It's a funny thing, even though the shuls did exist at the time of the Second Temple. But he's saying that when you sit in shul and you're praying, and that's taking the place of the sacrifices, you realize even more so that you don't have the temple. It's an interesting idea. And he says certainly Shabbos you shouldn't play them, because it's true that it's only rabbinic, but it's not considered a mitzvah to play musical instruments during davening. Now, if you ask the non-Jew, that would be shvus to shvus, would be 2 different rabbinic things, one layered on top of the other. Maybe that would be different. He doesn't mention that. We can't create a new mitzvah. And our tradition for prayer is without instruments. How can we permit a rabbinic decree of not playing instruments on Shabbos? So he's just really answering the Shabbos part, although parenthetically he's also touched on instruments generally. We've seen psachim that there might be a worry about carrying such a thing on Shabbos. Masha Einam Maftirin Benavi, and the other question that they don't do the maftir. I guess by this time even they were skipping the Haftorah. Maybe for Kiddush Club, I don't know. Alohu Mishnah Arucha Aresh Karka Kore Omed Maftir Benavi. It says in the Mishnah that you have to read the Navi on Shabbos. How can you get rid of that? They're over in Al Divrei Chazal. They're going against the words of the rabbis. Okay, so what about praying in the local language? So he says you can't do that. Now it's true that we have a Mishnah that says the following you can do in any language, and prayer is part of that. It does seem like you can pray in any language. You fulfill your mitzvah of prayer in any language. He says, nevertheless, that's only an individual who's doing it once in a while. But to make it a consistent practice for a congregation to pray in anything but Hebrew, he says that is definitely forbidden. Vada Gomer, it's definitely forbidden. Because if not, if that was true, why would the men of the Great Assembly have structured the prayer, have written the prayers in Hebrew? Even in their day, people spoke other languages. So why didn't they just say, okay, pray as a community and pray in whatever your language happens to be? They didn't do that. They made it in Hebrew. So he makes a distinction here between the individual praying and the community praying. The individual, if they don't understand Hebrew, can pray in any language they want. They would fulfill their mitzvah, but a community, he says, cannot or should not. He brings some other proofs for that. And he says the rabbis only decreed it should be in Hebrew publicly. They wanted prayer to be in the language of the prophets. As the Rambam also writes, the rabbis knew that it shouldn't be just in any language communally. The Imkain Lamali Mikdash Avodah Klal. In other words, because the concept of the decree generally of rabbinic prayer in a community, in a certain structure, is to take the place of the sacrifices. And sacrifices have a certain order, and they have they're very specific. Rakim Tiknim, there is a concept of individual prayer, but that's different. They're trying to take the place in the Shalom Parmsafasenu. Our prayers take the place of the sacrifices. That has to be done in a certain way, in a certain language, when it's communal. Okay, so he says the fact that people don't have much knowledge and they don't understand Hebrew. So he says, what should we do with that? He says, therefore, so let's teach them the meaning of the prayers and let them pray in Hebrew. That's a good answer. He says when you speak before a king, you're not going to speak in a different language. You have to learn the language the king speaks, or else it'd be ridiculous. It's not derech eretz, it's not honor to speak the language to a king that he doesn't understand, or it's not his language. And the Ramban says, I guess in a certain place in Kitisa, that Lashon HaKodesh, the language of Hebrew, is the language of God. And that's the language that God spoke to the prophets. And the rabbis say that in Hebrew, the world was created. We have midrashim like that. And in the Torah itself, it says Chava is named Chava, Kihi Em Kol Chai. That when names are explained in the Torah, it's explained with Hebrew. The onomatopoeia of certain things that are described in the Torah is clearly Hebrew. So that's the language of God, the language which God gave the Torah in. And we shouldn't make decrees. We shouldn't transform. Right? This distinction between the private and the communal, I think, is a very important one. It's true that a person in private can pray in any language they want. There's no question about that. But he's saying that communal prayer is different. Communal prayer is about taking the place of sacrifices. Communal prayer is about something else. It's more akin to the idea of temple service. It's something that is for the whole Jewish people as a fixed routine. I mean, many people speak about today how you go anywhere in the world and you go into a shul and you know exactly what they're doing because it's in Hebrew. He's not necessarily saying that, but this idea I think makes a lot of sense that when it's a communal decree, when it's for the whole Jewish people, so that's different than just individualized prayer. And that's how the men of the Great Assembly who wrote the Amidah did it. And strengthening those who argue, if you want to argue about it, those who argue that it should be in the original language, they have much more power. Al-Kain b'masha hachrazatam beit haKnesset hakadosha shalachem la'aser leispalel b'sidurei laz shalem. That which you have made a decrees in Hamburg in the Orthodox shuls, that it's forbidden to use the German Siddurim that the Reform have published. They did publish the first Siddur, I think, in 1819. Kimbalashon HaKodesh, that prayer can only be in Hebrew, in Siddurim that we have, and that you should not use an organ in the shul, certainly on Shabbos. Ketorah asita, you're doing the right thing. It's so funny, right? Now, the Hamburg Besdin has basically said, no organs in Orthodox shuls, no German prayer books, and they have to have a Chassam Sofer, back them up. You're doing the right thing. Torah asita. It's funny, and it's not usually the way it's early on. So, Yehi Kain Hashem Imachem. God is with you. As if there's they have doubt. They're not sure. Should we forbid the organ in the German prayer book? Right? Because you could argue for it. I mean, we saw that. We saw those arguments. V'im safek ki kol hagaonim chachmei azman yaskimu ima Israhu. And if you're worried that all the rabbis are not going to agree with this decree that you're making, that you're not allowed to have organs and shul, certainly on Shabbos, you're not allowed to pray in the vernacular, he says, don't worry, the rabbis are going to agree, and I agree. Lesser Isser al hanefesh kol Yisrael, to say that it's forbidden for all the Jewish people to do those things. Anybody changes something, they should be saved from wickedness and will rebuild the temple. He wrote this on the second day of Rosh Chodesh Teves, Chanukah, Tav Kuf Ayin Tes. That is 1819. Chanukah 1819.
Does he touch on the use of the adoption of Aramaic for Putim and Kaddish? I mean, that was a vernacular at one time.
Yeah, that is true. Now, yeah, I mean, and the reading of the Torah we translated into Aramaic. That's a good point. Now, I did not see that as an argument in Noga HaTzedek, which was the book that was arguing for these changes. They did not mention that. I mean, on the contrary, you could say that obviously the rabbis had thought about this because some prayers are in the vernacular, are in Aramaic, and they didn't make the other ones in Aramaic, right? In other words, Aramaic was what people understood. I mean, you could use it as an argument precisely against changing the language. Now, in that other book that we looked at, Noga HaTzedek, first 40 pages, which is what we looked at, are letters from 3 Orthodox rabbis. The rest of it is called Or Noga, and it's about 75 pages, written just by that one person who published the book, who was more of a reformer, and he's basically arguing for these changes. So I don't know if he says it. That's a good question. Does he? We could look at some of his arguments. He was more radical. But I'm very intrigued by how, the Chassam Sofer, who is such a radical and so strong in these issues, you can feel how it's not so strong. You can feel how like there's this sense of you have to justify forbidding the organ and shul and prayers in German, and that's funny. It's on the one hand, the reform at this point is even already pretty radical, and there's a offshoot, or even more radical offshoot of the reform in Germany, as we mentioned, that wanted to get rid of circumcision and move Shabbos to Sunday. I mean, that's wild. But yet, at least for Hungarian rabbis, there must have been a sense that maybe they couldn't, conceive of it. Maybe they're thinking about the neologues. I don't think that existed this early. Maybe it did. You see that that even the view of the Chassam Sofer is this isn't so out of the ballpark. It's on some level with, if you have to argue that, don't worry, we're going to support you, Hamburg Besden, in forbidding organs and shul on Shabbos. Like, you see it's not as, crazy as it becomes later, or as out of the realm as it is later. Let's see. I want to stop here, and maybe we'll do another letter or two. I will look back in that book, Noga HaTzedek, and see what other arguments he makes. I'm not sure we would take his arguments as seriously as the three rabbis that wrote in, because those rabbis had more. The person who published it did not have the same clout, the same level of learning. I think he maybe left Judaism later. But as those three, but I will take a look and see if he has any other additional arguments pro-reform. But you could see where, if it's coming down to the question of instruments on a weekday. It's funny that Rabbi, right, that much later, 50 years later, the tshuva that we saw from Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, he rejects weekday instruments so out of hand. I guess the 50 years just changes everything. It's just a totally different world. Maybe even 60 or 70. Once reform is, really up and running. It's just the cultural differences. It's a different world. Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.